Welcome, life science learners, to another installment. You guys have looked at DNA in the past. Today we're looking at the role of DNA and replication. There's a lot that we need to discuss today. So let's get out those notepads. Let's try and engage with the content. And I'm hoping that you've got some questions that you can write down and I can get to them as we discuss. So let's look at DNA and, very important, replication. It's important at this point that we have some reflection on kind of what the structure of DNA is, to look at where it's found before we get into understanding the process of replication. So I'm going to spend some time looking at a recap, and then we're going to move on to the process of replication. So please bear with me. So I'm sure you always have had thoughts about DNA and what information it codes for. So we're going to spend some time trying to understand what the concept of a gene is today. We're going to focus on the nucleus, genes and chromosomes in this segment. As a recap of nucleic acids, we're going to talk about that. And most importantly today, we're going to look at this complex process of replication. And we're going to unpack the different models. More importantly is the process, its significance, and when it occurs. So let's get straight into some key concepts as we unpack. And these are some key words that are important that I would use through this lesson. So the concept of what chromatin network is. Chromosomes, we're going to unpack what chromosomes are and how they're made up of chromatids. We're going to look at histone proteins forming an important part of a chromatid. A very important concept to understanding replication is the genes and the role of genes. And we've mentioned nucleotides as the building blocks of DNA. And we know that these contain different nitrogenous bases. We're going to spend some time just looking at DNA and comparing that to RNA. And I will mention the types of RNA and DNA, and we're going to talk briefly about mitochondrial DNA. We can also refer to complementary base pairing, especially when we look at DNA replication, and we're going to possibly get to chromosome mapping during the course of the lesson. So a quick recap of the structure of the nucleus. Remember that the nucleus is that organelle in the cell that contains the chromatin network. And if you look very carefully into this diagram, you can see that I've got an illustration of a shadow of a chromosome in there. And that chromosome contains the genetic information that's wrapped up around histone proteins. We know that the nucleus has nucleopores. It has got an inner and outer membrane, which basically controls the movement of substances into and out of the cell. It has an internal solution called the nucleoplasm, and it has a little structure called the nucleolus, which is linked to how the nucleus carries out its functions, especially in terms of cell division. So we've looked at the structure of DNA. We said that it contains, it's found in the nucleus, and it forms part of what we know as chromatin. And chromatin is actually can be arranged into a compact structure known as chromosomes, which I will illustrate to you in the next couple slides. We mentioned that the nucleus is surrounded by a double envelope, which contains two layers, and it has pores which allows the movement of substances in and out. The nucleus also contains a region called the nucleolus, which is a little structure in there which we know controls how the nucleus functions. The nucleus contains DNA in the form of chromatin, as I mentioned, and that chromatin we know is basically chromosomes that are wrapped around histone proteins in a very complex structure. It's important that we have an overview of the structure of a chromosome. We often draw this as an X-shaped structure. And it's important that you understand that this X-shaped structure is essentially DNA that's complex structure wrapped around histone proteins. Okay? And so these chromosomes are thread-like structures that are located inside the nucleus of an animal cell and plant cells. And these chromosomes contain proteins called histone proteins around which the DNA is wrapped. Okay, and obviously it's important that we understand that the term chromosome is made up of two words, chroma and soma, which refers to color, bodies, and this is indicative of how the chromosome basically stains with different colors to produce these bright colors, which scientists have termed chromosomes, using color and body to break up that. Again, an overview of the structure. We know that DNA is a double-stranded molecule. It contains complementary base pairs. It is arranged in a helical structure, which we see here. And if we compare that to the other type of nucleic acid, which is RNA, we see that RNA is single-stranded. The location of the nucleus. It's important for us to understand the context of where the nucleus is and what it contains. So the DNA occurs mainly in the nucleus, which is formed part of the chromatin network. It is also known as chromosomal DNA. So we have DNA found in the nucleus known as chromosomal DNA. We also have DNA found outside the nucleus, and that's found in the mitochondria as well as the chloroplast in plant cells. DNA is a polynucleotide structure, guys, made up of many nucleotides. It is a polymer, and it's made up of building blocks called nucleotides. So these monomers of DNA are called DNA nucleotides. So these are the monomers. It's important that we unpack that the structure of each monomer or each nucleotide consists of three parts: a sugar molecule, a phosphate group, and a nitrogen containing base. And now I've illustrated that here. So we see a phosphate molecule attached to the sugar. We see a nitrogenous base here, and we know that these are made up of adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. As I mentioned here, as a recap, we know that these are 3 or 4 different types of possible bases that are present on a nucleotide. This is crucial to us moving forward. The concept of a gene. What is a gene? And often when we look at DNA, we refer to DNA containing genes. It's important that we understand that a gene is a sequence of DNA that has a special meaning or codes for a unique function. So that gene is made up of a sequence of nucleotides that code for a specific function. And that talks to how DNA codes for characteristics. So a sequence of nucleotides that code for a specific characteristic or protein is called a gene. And a gene is essentially the basis of the physical and functional unit of hereditary information. So this is essentially how information is passed down from one cell to the next cell during cell division, as well as from one generation to the next generation in terms of reproduction. So genes are made up of DNA. Some of these genes basically act as instructions to make molecules called proteins. So in our future installments, we will look at a process of protein synthesis. And so genes code for the information to make specific proteins. We also know that genes do not code for proteins in some instances. They code for how cells express themselves or how certain processes occur in a cell. So we're going to have to look at that as well. So a gene, if we were to basically describe that, is a segment of DNA that codes for a specific characteristic, which is referred to as coding DNA. It is important for us to understand that we have lots of DNA, but not all of that DNA codes for characteristics. It is said that only 2% of our DNA actually codes for specific characteristics. If we look at the other 98%, we refer to that as non-coding DNA. And so, as I mentioned, that 98% of our DNA is referred to as non-coding DNA. In some textbooks, we've referred to non-coding DNA previously as nonsense DNA or junk DNA. However, as scientists have understood the sequencing of DNA and the Human Genome Project, we're able to identify how the non-coding DNA seems to now have a significant role in helping the coding DNA express itself. So the non-coding DNA is important in allowing for the expression of some genes. So that's important for us to take note of. So genes can have one of two functions, guys. Genes, when we refer to them and we talk about structural genes, these carry the code for one or more proteins. So these genes basically produce proteins. But we also have regulatory genes. And these are genes that regulate processes in cells and organisms. So broadly classifying genes, we have these, as I mentioned, structural genes that code for making specific characteristics of proteins. And we have regulatory genes, which basically switch on or switch off certain processes in the cell. And that's important in us understanding how genes carry out their functions. The concept of a gene locus, and the word locus is derived from the word location. And so we know that genes have a specific position that they occupy. They have a specific length, and they're found on unique chromosomes. And so that position of a gene on a chromosome is referred to as its locus. So the locus is the position of a gene on a chromosome. We will come across the term allele, and that concept of allele is important for us to unpack as we move on. Let's expose ourselves to what an allele is. An allele is essentially a different form of the same gene. So if we think of a simple characteristic like eye color, we've got different variations in eye color. If we think of left-handed and right-handedness, those are the different or the alternative forms of the expression of a gene. So we have alleles for those different expressions of genes. Right, so in this illustration, I've illustrated a pair of homologous chromosomes. Again, the concept of homologous chromosomes comes from the fact that these chromosomes are similar in shape and size, and they basically are representing an allele for white flower. In this case, it's indicated by this purple region, and on a corresponding chromosome, the allele for purple flower. What is important is in this we understand the concept of what is the location for this specific gene, and we use the term locus. And so essentially, by me trying to illustrate the position of a locus, I'm using this image to show you where that specific gene is found. And so remember that that gene is DNA that is wrapped around histone proteins that codes for, in this case, the color of flower. And these homologous chromosomes essentially point to structures that are where DNA is found and wrapped around histone proteins. So guys, we've looked at the nucleus, we've looked at the genes, and we've tried to unpack what a chromosome is. It's important that we understand this context before we move into the process of DNA replication. So I'm going to pause here. We're going to move into the next segment looking at the process of DNA replication. See you in a little while, shortly after the break.